Good morning, and welcome to part 2 of our study of the book of Esther. This is a book of intrigue and of suspense and of backstabbing and of behind-the-scenes manipulation and of a number of different events which either by extreme coincidence or by God's manipulation enable God to achieve what he wanted to achieve with this story. If you were with me last week, you'll recall that King Ahashuwares had called together the princes of his kingdom for a large banquet. And this banquet went on for half a year in total, where he tried to impress with the princes and with the leaders of his provinces his wealth, his importance, his prosperity, his ability to fight a war against Greece. At that time, Persia was the largest empire on earth, and his attempt to conquer Greece was to enlarge that empire. So he had called this large banquet and gathering together in order to impress upon his generals and his commanders how wealthy, how important he was, and how able he was to fight this battle. And after this large banquet, he threw another banquet for the citizens of the city, the capital city of his province. Now, the first real strange incident occurred when Ahashuwares became rather drunk, along with many of his compatriots, and he called his queen to come and show herself to these men. Now, this was in a culture where this was not usually done. So this was an unusual incident, probably because he himself was a bit inebriated at the time. The second thing that happened was that the queen, Ashti, refused to come. Now, refusal of the king in those days usually meant sudden death. But that did not happen. What happened was that King Ahashuwares, with consult with his confreres, decided that she should be banned and that a law should be made forcing women to respect their husbands in such situations. This was considered the law of the Medes and the Persians and was put into effect so that Vashti was banned as queen and that other women would respect their husbands when they were called upon to do so. This was the situation at the end of chapter 1. Now, as we start chapter 2, there's a period of time has elapsed. We don't know exactly how long. Some say up to 4 years, but certainly a year or two has elapsed between chapter 1 and 2, because during that period of time, as it says, after these things, during that period of time, the war with Greece had been fought and lost, and King Ahashuwares lost most of his fleet, many of his men, because the better trained Greek soldiers, even though they were outnumbered by the Persians, defeated the Persian armies. So King Ahashuwares came back to his capital, a defeated man, and also with no queen to comfort him. So this brought up the third unusual circumstance in this story. It says in the first of chapter 2, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahashuwares subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Now, some people say that he would have taken Queen Vashti back. He regretted what he had done, and he would have taken her back except for the law of the Medes and Persians, which had been put in place against her and against all women which disobeyed their husbands. So this put him in a bit of a funk, considering he had also lost the war and now had no way to get his queen back. So this third unusual circumstance developed when the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women." Now this was an area which young women could be brought into, an area in the palace. And the idea was that all the beautiful young virgins in the whole country would be brought together for the king to examine and choose a new queen from. Most queens and most marriages in those days were arranged for either political or for military purposes, advantages, alliances between countries, alliances between nations. So this was an unusual way for a king to obtain a new queen, to have a contest where all the beautiful young women would be brought together so the king could choose one. But this is what the king's servants suggested, and this apparently pleased the king, and so it came to pass. And let beauty preparations be given them. Let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Ashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So he made arrangements for this to come. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from the Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So this goes back to the days when Babylon overtook Judah under King Nebuchadnezzar and carried away Kish, the great-grandfather of Mordecai. And Mordecai was now a Jew living in Persia. Now some question why he had not gone back when the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem under the reign of King Darius and as recorded in Ezra. But he apparently did not. He had obtained a position of some import in the king's palace, as many of the Jewish people had done in the Persian Empire. They had obtained positions of some importance and maybe became very wealthy and were well established and had no desire to go back to Jerusalem, even though God had commanded them to do so. But this is another story. Anyway, Mordecai was a Jew who now worked in the palace, and he had some apparent influence with the king and with these princes and these officers that the king had commanded to go into all the provinces to find these young women. So, Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. So Esther was an orphan, and she'd been brought up by Mordecai, her uncle. Mordecai was believed to be around 40 years of age, and Esther was believed to be around 20 at the time this was written. Now the name Hadassah really means myrtle. So the name Esther is a Persian, either a Persian nickname for myrtle because of the name Hadassah, maybe they couldn't get the name pronounced properly, or it was also a Persian name meaning star because of her beauty and because of her demeanor. Anyway, Esther was the Persian name for myrtle. And the young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we have this Jew, Mordecai, working in the palace with this adopted daughter, Esther, when this command went out to bring all the beautiful virgins to the king, for him to choose a new queen. This is how Esther became involved in this story. So this was the next circumstance, was the fact that Mordecai, a Jew, was working in the Persian king's palace and had this daughter, or this adopted daughter, Esther. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now Esther was brought into this area of the palace. Whether she wanted to go or not is a question, but in any case, being a young and a virgin, and named with a Persian name, she was taken along with the other women into the palace under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who looked after these women. Now the young women pleased. Now the young woman pleased Haggai. For some reason, Haggai took a bit of an interest in Esther. She pleased him, and she was in his favor. This is another coincidence which you have to understand. If God was arranging this, God had a hand in this, because God now found or made Esther a favorite of Haggai. And she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. So she had an allowance from the king, but Haggai went above that and gave her beauty preparations. Then 7 choice maidens were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So Esther was shown considerable favor. She was not known to be Jewish, but she was shown favor, probably because God had put this in Haggai's mind, that he had enjoyed Esther. She found favor with him, so she had some extra advantages. She had maidservants, the best place in the king's and the women's part of the palace, and Hagar gave her extra preparation. Because Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. So Mordecai had told her not to reveal the fact that she was Jewish. Now, is it right to deny your heritage? Is it right to deny that you're a Christian if you really are a Christian? Or to deny that you're Jewish if you're really Jewish? In most cases, no. But sometimes it is necessary not to reveal facts, even though you may not deny them. Maybe it's necessary not to reveal facts in order for certain other events to take place, and that's what's happening here. Mordecai had told her not to reveal her family or her heritage, and he sort of went every day outside the women's area to watch for her, to try to keep watch over her. And it says that he paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of her welfare and what was happening to her. So Esther was now in the women's quarters, and Mordecai was trying to look out for her the best he could. So you can see the story unfolding. Each woman came to go to the king, Ahashuwares, after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So this whole process, after the women were in the women's quarters, it was a whole year that they were there before they went before the king. Now this was a long time of preparation. They had to actually learn how to present themselves, perhaps learn how to make themselves more beautiful, more attractive to the king, learn some of the regulations of the court. But in addition, there were 2 other reasons. First of all, it made assurance that none of the women were actually secretly pregnant when they were brought into the women's quarters. And therefore, if they had been pregnant, the king could not be blamed for it because they had not seen him for at least a year. And secondly, in those days, hygiene was not as it is today. So some of the women who didn't bathe, some of the women who didn't properly clean themselves, would have some malodorous effect to them, which had to be overtaken by the perfumes and the myrrh. And this might have taken some time for them to learn how to apply this and how to use this. Therefore, the whole time of preparation took almost a year. Thus prepared, such young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. Many people took jewelry and took extra clothes and took special things with them to try to impress the king further. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the woman into the custody of Shashgazar, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. So these young women would go from the house of the women would go in and spend a night with the king, one night. And after that they would go to the house of the concubines. They would not go back to the king unless he called for them. They would, however, never be allowed to marry, never be allowed to leave the house of the concubines. They would be forever a concubine of the king, to be there at his bidding, his command. So if he did not choose this woman to be queen, she might languish in this house for years and never see the king, never have any more contact with him, even though she was not allowed to leave or to marry someone else. So this was not really the great honor sometimes that it seemed to be. They were sort of slaves or complete servants of the king, even if he did not choose them. So this is what happened after the morning, after spending a night with the king. They would go back to the house of the concubines and spend the rest of their life there unless the king called for them again. Now it says, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Halibah, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. So she did not take a lot of extra material or apparel with her, or extra perfume, jewelry, etc. She just took the basics. And Esther obtained favor in the light of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahashuwares into his royal palace on the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So if you recall, the party in chapter 1 was held in the 3rd year of his reign. So this is 4 years after that party was held. And during that period of time, he had fought the war with Greece and lost it. King Ashti had been deposed. And this idea of these young women going to the king had been going on for some time, because there were many of them, and each one spent a night with the king. Now it was Esther's turn. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Ashti. Then the king made a great feast, the Feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So, as you might have guessed from the story title, that Esther became the queen in place of Vashti. Esther, a Jew, who was not known at the time by the king to be Jewish, but she found favor with the king. So after all these circumstances, the drunken stupor in which he had ordered Queen Vashti to come before the men, Queen Vashti's refusal, her being deposed as queen, and this strange idea of the king's servants to have all the virgins come in a contest before the king, all of these strange coincidences ended up with a Jewish queen in Persia. Esther was crowned queen, and of course King Ahashuwares threw another great party, a feast for this occasion. He threw another party called the Feast of Esther, and he gave allowances, privileges, presents to the provinces. He gave a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. Now, while this was all happening, Mordecai was still a member of the king's retinue in a way, and part of his official staff. And according to the book, he overheard 2 of the king's eunuchs plotting to kill Ahashuwares. Now, plots in those days were not uncommon. And in fact, Ahashuwares was eventually killed by two of his subordinates in an assassination. So for Mordecai to hear somebody plotting against the king would not be probably unusual. But he also was afraid for Esther. So Esther had not revealed her family, and Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed her command of Mordecai when she was brought up by him. So the king still didn't know Esther was a Jewish lady. And two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahashuwares. Why? Because perhaps some of the other women were not chosen by the king to be queen. Perhaps they knew or secretly knew that Esther was Jewish. Perhaps it was some other reason. But these two people became very upset with King Ahashuwares and plotted to kill him. And Mordecai, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther. And Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, gave Mordecai the credit for unveiling this plot. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed. So the king just didn't act upon Mordecai's word. He did an investigation, and it was confirmed that what Mordecai had said was true. And it was confirmed that both were hanged on a gallows. Now, we don't know exactly what being hanged on a gallows meant, because there were different ways of execution in those days. One was by crucifixion, as Christ was crucified on a cross. One was by hanging. One was also by impaling on a stick and having your body drawn over the stick. And therefore it was a very slow, painful death. But these two were executed because of their plot against the king. And it was confirmed both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This book was quoted by Herodotus in his histories, and it was also quoted by Josephus. So this book is known, and this chronicle was known, and this event was therefore known. So now we have the simple fact that Esther has been made queen by some strange situation, probably through God's manipulation, but she was chosen queen. She had found favor with Haggai, the keeper of the queen of the king of the women's house, and she had been instructed and coached by him. So she had found favor also with King Ahashuwares and became queen. Was this all manipulated behind the scenes by God? Apparently so, because there are too many just coincidences to have happened. And then on top of it all, Mordecai, who had a low position in the king's household, overheard a plot to kill the king, reported this to Esther, who reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. The plot was confirmed by investigation, and the perpetrators were executed. Both Mordecai and Esther found increased favor with the king as a result of this. So the plot thickens, the story goes on. Esther is now the queen. Mordecai is now higher ranked in the king's household. Both are Jews. Perhaps Mordecai is known. Esther, however, is not known to be Jewish. And so the plot goes on from here. And we'll continue the story next week with further evidences of how God manipulates people, gets his will, even through people who don't believe in him, to undertake what he desires. So join me next week for chapter 3 in the ongoing saga of the book of Esther. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.